Throughout the long history of aviation, many companies, or individuals, have proposed new, radical, and innovative designs, only to find that their ambitions on paper rather outstripped their capacity to make things work in practice. The Koolhoven FK.55 is one such example. The mid-1930s was a period of rapid development in the field of aviation technology. Not only was the expanding and ever-competitive commercial industry stimulating development in the form of more efficient, safer, and sturdier aircraft, but various conflicts around the world, particularly the Sino-Japanese War and the Spanish Civil War, were accelerating the development of military aircraft. In a period of less than 10 years, things had gone from fabric-covered biplanes to all-metal monoplane designs, complete with features such as retractable landing gear, fully enclosed cabins, and various flight control aids. Things that we take for granted nowadays, but were considered cutting-edge back then. During this period, many manufacturers attempted to rewrite the book on how military aircraft should be designed, and one of the best ways to showcase their so-called innovations was to display them at the various airshows that formed the beating heart of the aviation community. The Paris Air Show was one such event, and it was during the 1936 show that a Dutch aircraft manufacturer called Koolhoven surprised many by showing off a sleek new fighter. It was not, in fact, a working fighter aircraft, but rather a mock-up of what the company intended to build, the Koolhoven FK.55. Designed by Frederick Koolhoven, the company's founder, it was a stark departure from his previous, more conservative designs, and it was a strong indicator of the growing need for new fighter aircraft, or more specifically, the growing desperation of various European countries trying to hastily rearm in the latter half of the 1930s. The FK.55 mock-up showed off several innovative features. The engine, which was a liquid-cooled V12, was installed behind the cockpit near the aircraft's centre of gravity. This allowed the pilot to be seated further forward, and combined with a clean canopy design, it provided excellent visibility. At the nose, and housed in a streamlined spinner, was a pair of contra-rotating propellers. These were driven by a shaft that ran from the engine, under the pilot's seat, and through to a reduction gear unit. Also mounted in the nose was a 20mm cannon that fired through the propeller hub, and this was to be complemented by 4 wing-mounted 7.7mm machine guns. Other innovative features of the FK.55 was its streamlined design and unorthodox control surfaces, though the latter didn't remain in this form for very long. When viewed from the front, the fuselage seemed to almost have a triangular cross-section, and the shoulder-mounted wings blended smoothly into it. This streamlined design, combined with the benefit of contra-rotating propellers doing away with the dangers of P-factor, was hoped to make the FK.55 an easy aircraft to learn for rookie pilots. And to improve strength, particularly in high-speed maneuvers, the center section of the wing was built integral with the fuselage, with the remaining section connected by spars. Unfortunately, not much information can be found on the exact design of the wings, so I can't go into detail, but I do know that initially it was proposed to do away with ailerons in favour of so-called slot spoilers. Now, these appeared to have been envisioned as rotating, slotted cylinders that would extend into the slipstream to control the aircraft's roll, but the idea was dropped by the time of the Paris Air Show as they were covered over in the mock-up, and they never featured on the prototype itself. Now, as for the actual prototype, and oh dear, this is where things begin to go completely sideways for this poor little thing, it was one thing to display a new innovative design as a static concept piece, but to put it into practice was another matter entirely. At the end of 1936, or at least during the spring of 1937, work had begun on building a fully functional prototype of the FK.55, and almost immediately the design team ran into a proverbial minefield of problems. During the early phases of construction, it must have been apparent that the cooling system for the aircraft was inadequate, to put it nicely, as there were multiple changes to both the design of the air intakes and the physical dimensions of the engine's radiators. The resizing of the radiators was particularly detrimental as it required redesigning the shape of the fuselage, replacing its sleek lines with something far more cumbersome. The added weight from this change also meant that the landing gear decided to break. Its effectiveness was already under question before the changes, as landing gears on high-mounted wings often presented difficulties during this time, and the design team was forced to install a fixed landing gear as a temporary measure until the original could be strengthened, if it could be strengthened at all. Owing to the redesign of the fuselage and the decision of the retractable gear, the wing also had to be adjusted. As it no longer benefited from the support of the landing gear struts on the ground, the wing had to be reinforced, which made it slightly thicker, and as a result it no longer seamlessly blended into the fuselage like it had on the concept model. All of this, of course, would increase drag. All of this meant that, even though the prototype was completed without armament, it was still considerably heavier than originally planned. The mock-up had a projected loaded weight of 1,650 kilograms, but the prototype weighed 2,280 kilograms. From what I can find in the limited information available, the engine was unchanged, a 680 or 700 horsepower Lorraine-Petrel water-cooled V12. This is somewhat supported by the gearing of the propellers, as the alternative engine, a 1000 horsepower Sterner, spun its propellers in the opposite direction, but again, sources on this are hazy at best. But what we do know is the FK.55, in its new ungainly form, did not impress. On the 30th of June 1938, it was taken to Vliegtuigen airfield for its first flight. Koolhoven test pilot Thomas Koppers first put it through a series of ground tests, taxiing about at ever-increasing speeds, and eventually completing several test hops at takeoff speed before attempting a full flight. He did not have high opinions of the aircraft, and had already complained about engine heating before prepping for takeoff, but he still took the FK.55 for its first, and as it turned out, final flight. He was in the air for a grand total of 2 minutes. Not long after taking off, and flying at a relatively low altitude, Koppers immediately turned around and landed. What followed was an apparently animated and heated argument between him and Fritz Koolhoven, the latter wanting to know why he had abandoned the test flight, and the former explaining that the engine was heating up the cabin at such a rapid rate that he would have been broiled alive, and that the plane handled poorly, which was a nicer way of saying that it was so fat, sluggish, and unstable that it was borderline unflyable. All of the design changes, combined with the centrally mounted engine, had produced an airframe that needed exceptionally skilled hands to manage. Following this, the team at Koolhoven made attempts to improve the design, though unfortunately nothing came of it. Fritz Koolhoven himself had lost interest in the project, believing a complete redesign to be a waste of money and resources, and the onset of the war in Europe curtailed all further development. As if to rub salt in the wound, the prototype, as well as the entire Koolhoven factory, was then destroyed by a German bombing raid on the 10th of May 1940. And so, the FK.55 had gone from a promising concept that looked not unlike a Dutch equivalent of the P-39 to an overweight, underpowered, and dangerously unstable piece of burning wreckage. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the patrons. Now, I'm going to be away for the latter half of November, so at some point after the 17th, I won't be updating the end page of the video again until the end of the month, so just a heads up for that. A special shout out as always to the Wing Commander tier patrons, the highest tier members of this special group. Now, I'll be putting up this month's Q&A thread on Patreon soon, so keep an eye out for that. And as always, I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.